Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Semi-Slav defense with the Moscow variation. And today we are going to be looking at move 5, bishop g5 for white. Yesterday we've been looking at the move e3, which leads to Meran variations or anti-Meran variations, and is considered to be less aggressive than the move bishop g5. So after bishop g5, we now have what is, well, branching out into some of the most aggressive variations of the Semi-Slav defense. There are two options here, well, three options basically. Either knight b to d7, which leads to normal slow positions, d takes c4, which leads to the Botvinnik Semi-Slav, or h6, which leads to the Moscow or to the anti-Moscow. So if you haven't seen the introductory video on the Semi-Slav, please do that so that you can understand what this position is about. I have gone over that in the introductory video. So after bishop g5, we are looking at the move h6. Now, the move bishop h4 is the anti-Moscow variation, and that's my absolute favorite variation of the Semi-Slav and the most aggressive one. And I find it incredibly good for black. And the move bishop takes f6 is the Moscow, and we are going to be focusing on that today. So, bishop takes f6, the only natural move is queen takes. And now what white is trying to do, white is trying to play against black's Semi-Slav c8 bishop, which is trapped behind its own pawn chain. White is aiming to keep that bishop there and use the fact that the queen is now on the f6 square, on the most natural square for the knight, which makes it tempo gain. The queen is often going to have to retreat back to d8. And as we are going to see, this position is going to be very different to what we've been looking at in the Meran and anti-Meran positions. Another thing that has to be pointed out is that white has relinquished his bishop pair. White no longer has a dark squared bishop. So if black manages to develop, if black manages to survive and open up his c8 bishop, open the position up and castle, black is going to be fine, better in any endgame because of his bishop pair. Now, one of the most usual plans in the Moscow for black is to play g6, bishop g7. That's one thing you need to take note of. Since you don't have a dark squared bishop as white, the most annoying thing for black to do is to use his own bishop as best as possible, and the best way to do it is on the long diagonal. Furthermore, your c8 bishop isn't going to be developed in Meran fashion with d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and then b5, a6, c5. You are going to go most often for the e5 break, supported by your queen on f6, sometimes on f6, sometimes on e7, sometimes on c7. And e5 is going to be played more commonly, although c5 is also a break. But one thing you have to remember is that if you don't play one of these two moves, eventually your bishop is going to be dead and your game is going to be lost. We are going to be looking at 4 different moves for white. e3, which is the best move and the most commonly played move. Queen b3, which is in my opinion the most annoying move. Queen c2, which I wouldn't give too much credit. And g3, which is also a sideline that you have to know, but it isn't as dangerous. We're going to go over g3 first. The main idea of this move is to place the light squared bishop on the long diagonal to make it harder to play c5 or e5, because that weakens the d5 square and it's being attacked by the bishop when it's on g2. So it's a fairly logical move visually, but it doesn't really accomplish what it's supposed to. Knight d7 for black, bishop g2, and now d takes c4, using the fact that the bishop has gone from its most natural diagonal. And this is going to be thematic for many queen's pawn openings when black has responded classically with d5. So when the light squared bishop fianchettos, you have the option of taking on c4 and forcing white to do something about that. So castles, bishop e7, any b5 is slightly risky because, well, the bishop is very active on the diagonal. Knight e4, attacking the queen. The downside for black, of course, is that the queen is unnatural on f6, doesn't have that many useful squares. So queen f5, knight e to d2, attacking the pawn. b5 doesn't really work once again. Here is the opportunity for black to liberate his light squared bishop, on c8 with the move e5. And as soon as you have the opportunity to play either e5 or c5 and not get punished, when the bishop is fianchettoed, you definitely don't want to play c5 because then the bishop would be a monster. So in g3 lines, e5, if you can play it, play it. Knight takes c4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, queen f6, e3, castles, queen h5, something like knight b6, knight d2, queen g5, and you can see that the position is perfectly equal. Black's light squared bishop is alive, the queens are about to get traded off, and white basically doesn't have anything. In any endgame, black is going to be better because of his 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side. So the move g3, I wouldn't recommend in the Moscow variation for white. I just don't think it's challenging enough. Black gets the easy e5 in and has a comfortable game. The move queen c2 is also, well, not as challenging as queen b3 or e3. One thing that should be mentioned is that dc4 is possible here, e3 attacking the pawn, and now you can defend it with b5 because the bishop is not on g2. But now a4, breaking open the structure, and bishop b7, ab, cb, knight b, bishop b4 check, knight c3 has to return castles, and once again an equal position. Black shouldn't really be doing this. I'm not a big fan of dc4 against queen c2, but it should be noted that that's possible. One more thing, the bishop cannot really take on c4 because bishop f3 and black should be better. So in this position, just bishop e2 defending the knight, the pawn can be captured later on, and it's really likely that black is about to lose a pawn here. White has 6 healthy pawns, black has a weak c4 pawn, and that's why I don't like dc4. So after queen c2, I would recommend just normal play, knight d7, e4. One thing that should be mentioned for white is as soon as you can expand with e4, do that. Same as with black with e5 and c5. If you can liberate the bishop as black, do it. If you can play e4 as white, do it. Usually it's correct to take after e4, so d4, queen e4. g6, this is the plan I was talking about, putting the bishop on the long diagonal. Bishop d3, bishop g7, castles, castles, rook f1. And now the opportunity is here. The bishop is not fianchettoed on g2. You can play c5, you have castled, play c5. Now, if white takes, then it's not as good. You gain a tempo on the queen, you take the bishop, and you are better. So d5. After d5, there's a tricky variation here, which is the only playable variation. You have to defend your e6 pawn, so knight b6, and now d6 for white. You are creating a passed pawn and hoping to gain something from that later on. But in my opinion, this pawn is just weak, and this variation with queen c2, if this is the best white can get, I don't like it. For white, the bishop is going to d7 and to c6. It's going to be a great piece. This pawn is going to be rounded up most commonly, and I don't think white has any sort of advantage here. Bishop e4, knight takes c4, and play continues from here. It's equal, but as I said, white should be aiming for an advantage. So let's look at the two last moves, queen b3 and e3. Queen b3, as I said, because I play this position with black, not with white, I hate facing queen b3. There are two options for black here. One I prefer, one I think is, well, not that great. The one I don't like is dc4, queen c4, obviously, knight d7. And now either rook d1 or e3 for white should lead to very pleasant positions. I don't like exchanging this pawn that early. So now let's say rook d1, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2. That's always going to happen in the queen b3 line. Fianchettoing the light squared bishop is going to be the most common plan for white, and for black he's going to continue fianchettoing his dark squared bishop. So here we have a sort of even position in which it's hard for black to activate his bishop, so let me show you how to do that. Castles, white castles as well, and now as soon as you castle, e5 is the move you want to be playing. In this variation, it's supported by the queen and by the bishop and by the d7 knight, and very often you are going to have a chance to do that. So as soon as you manage to play e5, play e5. One difference in these lines is that knight has the e4 square, so after queen e7, I prefer white's light squared bishop, and that's why I find queen b3 annoying, and that's why I think that white is always slightly better in queen b3 lines. And pressure here is annoying, pressure here is annoying, your pawn is pinned, white's bishop is much better, your bishop is going to have to go to some ridiculous square like e6 or f5 or g4, which isn't really optimal. d6 is weak, and I mean, I think white is better here. This is one of the rare positions in which I think white is better. So that's why not dc4. After queen b3, I would recommend the move knight d7. And after knight d7, e4, as I said, as soon as white can play e4, he should play it. As soon as white plays e4, black should take it. So d4, knight e4, the queen drops to f4 in this position. Going to d8 wouldn't be active enough. You want to keep pressure on the knight, so queen f4. You always have c7, bishop d3. And now, can you play the move e5? Yes, you can. Play it. If you can play e5, play e5. e5. White castles, and now bishop e7, developing, rook f to e1, e takes d4. There are no really useful discoveries by the knight. The bishop is not really hanging. So bishop c2, and now knight c5, trying to trade, queen c3, declining the trade, and rook d8. This should be an equalish position. The pawn structure is symmetrical, so this is what I would recommend to fight queen b3. Just knight d7 and going for e5 as early as possible. But all these three moves, queen b3, queen c2, and g3, you are not going to see that often. In fact, you will probably see all of these moves 1 out of 10 or 20 games. e3 is going to be played almost all the time. Now, there are two ways to play this position. They can transpose, but they shouldn't if both sides play correctly. One way is to play g6, bishop g7 first, which I prefer. The other is to play knight d7 and continue from there. Still going for g6, bishop g7, but slightly different. So g6, if you do that, bishop d3, bishop g7, both sides castle, castles, castles, and now e4. As soon as white can play e4, he should play e4. As soon as white plays e4, black should take it. Knight takes, and now queen d8, the most common retreat. The knight is now defended, so queen f4 doesn't make too much sense. And now c5. This is a move which is double-edged. Obviously, you can see that any endgame is going to be better for black, because this pawn structure is just ridiculous. And you can see that this is hanging a pawn for the moment. But black is supposed to have a half a pawn here, not a whole pawn, and white is supposed to have compensation. So if bishop takes d4, which I've played several times and which I like because I play this line with g6, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and now queen c2 is the way to play. But knight d7, rook a d1, and just queen g7, and I don't think white has compensation for this pawn, not full compensation. Anyway, the thing white has is the d6 square for the knight, and this knight can be better than a pawn, obviously better than having an extra pawn, so the position becomes fairly tricky for black to play, but still a pawn is a pawn, and I want to have black here. Knight d5, bishop c4, preparing to take this knight, which is also a great piece. Rook d8, bishop takes, c takes, and now b4. And here you are going to see the compensation. Black has to play a5 here. I have had this position on my analysis board. I've never had it in a real game. But I found that the position gets trickier and trickier after b5. b6 is the best move here. If takes, the knight is hanging. If pushes, the knight is hanging. So knight takes c8, rook a takes c8. And now c takes b is a bad move. You would just win both the pawns. But c6, and the engines give this as equal, but from a human perspective, you have a passed pawn as black on d5, which is four squares away from queening, and white has a pawn on c6, which is very, very dangerous. And I mean, this is playable, and that's why I played the line with g6, but it's hard to play, and you could get in trouble, especially because the queen is able to target the b6 pawn, and it's not unlikely that the queen is going to win the b6 pawn, something like queen d2, queen e3, and already, how do you defend if rook b8, just c7? So as black, you have to be very careful here. Also, h6 is weak, and I mean, it's not a full pawn. The engines give it as no advantage for black, perfectly equal, but it's playable. But if you don't want to get into that, after the move e3, which is the main move, you should play knight d7, which is simpler. Bishop d3, dc4, bishop c4. This is similar to the Meran, but you don't continue with b5. You play g6, fianchettoing your bishop, castles, bishop g7, rook c1, castles. And now, once again, thematic plans. Can white play e4? Yes, he can. He should play e4. Now, since you don't have a d-pawn anymore, you have exchanged it, which I don't like, because I need my d5 pawn to be able to take on e4. In this variation with knight d7, you don't have it. Now you have to stop the advance. Allowing e5 would be bad. Allowing d5 would be bad, in fact. So we have to play e5. e5, if you can play it, open up your bishop and have an active game. And now, once again, taking is a mistake, so d5. Knight b6, attacking the bishop, dc6. Now, taking the bishop is not really a free piece, because if you take here, just knight d5, and you're going to be a pawn down. Something like queen d6, and it's a bad position. If you try something like queen takes c6, then knight here wins your queen, and game over. So after dc6, you don't take the bishop, you take bc6, and now bishop e2, saving the bishop. Rook d8, queen c2, bishop g4, and I always prefer white slightly. Your fianchettoed bishop is sort of blocked with the e5 pawn, which is also sort of a weakness. Your light squared bishop is not good. You're going to have to exchange it on f3. You have a weak c6 pawn. I mean, white seems to have everything here, and that's why I would recommend that in the main line of the Moscow, you don't go for knight d7, which is the main move. After e3, in my opinion, knight d7 is a harder move to play for black than g6, even though you get that pawn sec line for white, in which he ends up with a pawn on c6. But as I said, I find this more enjoyable and easier to play. So that's it. Tomorrow we are going to continue, or not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, we are going to continue with the anti-Moscow, and finally we are going to get into the aggressive semi-Slavs. For the end, I left the anti-Moscow and the Botvinnik semi-Slav, which is going to be really fun and crazy. Finally, some exciting variations. And tomorrow I'm playing a league game in the Croatian 4th League, and I'm going to analyze that in the Road to GM series after the game. Cross your fingers. I hope the game goes well. It's an important game for my team and for me. And now I'm off to prepare. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you like the Moscow Semi-Slav. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.